Welcome, dear listener, to another journey back through the mists of time. As the modern world fades away around you, I invite you to settle in, find a comfortable position, and allow your mind to wander with me to a place both beautiful and harsh, the medieval Scottish Highlands. Tonight's historical tale is crafted especially to help you unwind, to ease the tensions of your day, and perhaps to guide you gently toward peaceful slumber. I often wonder where in our vast world you might be listening from. Perhaps you're winding down after a long day, or maybe this is your morning ritual. I'd love to know. Please share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It brings me such joy to see our community of history enthusiasts gathering from across the globe. If you find comfort in these journeys through time, consider subscribing so you won't miss future explorations of our fascinating past. Each story is a doorway to another era, waiting to transport you away from modern concerns. Now, let us leave behind the electric lights and digital screens of our time. Close your eyes if you wish. Take a deep breath and allow yourself to be carried back nearly 800 years to the rugged, mist-shrouded hills of 13th century Scotland, a land of breathtaking beauty and unforgiving challenge. The wind howled across the Highland ridge, carrying with it the bitter promise of an early winter. Angus MacConnell pulled his woolen cloak tighter around his shoulders as he guided his small flock of sheep along the narrow path that wound between jagged rocks and patches of stubborn heather. The sky above hung low and gray, pressing down upon the mountains like a lid on a cauldron. "Move along now," he murmured to the animals, his calloused hand gripping a wooden staff worn smooth by years of use. "We must reach the lower pasture before the storm breaks." From his vantage point, high on the hillside, Angus could see the scattered dwellings of his clan nestled in the valley below. Simple structures of stone and thatch that huddled together as if for warmth against the coming cold. Thin wisps of peat smoke rose from their roofs, quickly torn apart by the relentless wind. This land had been home to the MacConnells for generations uncounted, each one scratching a living from the thin soil and harsh terrain, each one enduring as the seasons turned from brief, glorious summers to long, desperate winters. The Highland landscape showed little mercy to those who dwelled within its embrace. Rocky outcroppings thrust up from the earth like the bones of ancient giants, while hidden bogs waited to claim the unwary traveler. Yet there was beauty here too, a wild, untamed splendor in the purple heather that carpeted the hillsides in late summer, in the crystal-clear burns that tumbled down from snow-capped peaks, in the eagles that soared on thermal currents high above the glens. It was a beauty that demanded respect, for it could turn deadly in moments when storm clouds gathered and temperatures plummeted. As Angus descended toward the settlement, he could make out the figure of his brother Callum emerging from their shared dwelling. "The sheep are restless," Angus called as he drew nearer, his voice nearly lost in a sudden gust. "I've brought them down early. There's a storm brewing that I mislike the look of." Callum nodded grimly, his weather-beaten face creasing with concern as he gazed toward the darkening northern sky. "Aye, and it'll be a fierce one by the feel of it. Moira has been at the loom since dawn, trying to finish the weaving before the light fails. The children have gathered extra peat for the fire." He clasped his brother's shoulder with a strong hand. "Come inside. The elders have called a gathering in the great hall tonight. The laird himself will be present." The mention of their clan chief brought a solemn expression to Angus's face. In these isolated Highland communities, the clan was everything: family, protection, law, and livelihood, all bound together by blood and ancient loyalty. The MacConnell clan had held this valley for centuries, their fortunes rising and falling with the strength and wisdom of their leaders. The current laird, Duncan MacConnell, was a stern but fair man who had guided them through 3 harsh winters and a border skirmish with a neighboring clan. When he called the people together, it was never without purpose. Inside the low-ceilinged dwelling, warmth and familiar scents enveloped Angus. Peat smoke, wool, the herbs hanging from the rafters, and the simple porridge bubbling in the iron pot suspended over the central hearth. His wife Moira looked up from her loom, her fingers never ceasing their skilled dance across the threads. "The children brought in the last of the turnips from the field," she said by way of greeting. "Barely enough to see us through to midwinter, I fear." Their home, like most in the settlement, consisted of a single room where the family both lived and slept. The walls were stone, chinked with mud and straw for insulation, while the roof was thatched with heather and supported by sturdy wooden beams blackened by years of smoke. Their few possessions, cooking implements, tools, clothing, and bedding, were stored in wooden chests or hung from pegs on the walls. A small iron lamp provided meager light, supplemented by the glow from the hearth. Their 3 children were huddled near the fire, Fiona, the eldest at 12 years, mending a torn garment, young Malcolm of 8 summers, whittling a piece of wood, and little Eileen, barely 5, playing with a cloth doll stuffed with wool scraps. They looked up as their father entered, their faces brightening despite the perpetual hunger that had become their constant companion since midsummer. "Will there be stories tonight at the gathering, Father?" Malcolm asked eagerly, setting aside his carving. Angus ruffled the boy's hair with a gentle hand. "Perhaps, lad, though I suspect the laird has more serious matters to discuss." He moved to the hearth, warming his hands over the flames. "The harvest was poor this year, poorer than the last. The grain stores will not last until spring without careful rationing." This was the reality of Highland life, a constant calculation of resources against needs, of food stored against months of scarcity. Each day was a battle against the elements, against hunger, against the countless ways in which this beautiful, terrible land could claim the unwary or the unprepared. Yet the McConnells, like all Highland clans, had developed strategies for survival honed over countless generations. As dusk deepened into true night, the family prepared to make their way to the Great Hall, a larger stone building at the center of the settlement where the clan gathered for important occasions. Moira wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and checked that the children were properly dressed against the cold. "Take the offering," she reminded Angus, nodding toward a small bundle of wool and a jar of precious honey from their 2 hives, a token contribution to the communal stores that would help sustain those in greatest need during the coming winter. Outside, the wind had intensified, driving icy rain before it in stinging sheets. Other families were emerging from their dwellings, hunched against the weather, making their way by the light of covered lanterns toward the welcoming glow that spilled from the great hall's doorway. Despite the harshness of their lives, there was comfort in this gathering of the clan, in the knowledge that no McConnell would face the winter's trials alone. The great hall was already crowded when they arrived, filled with the murmur of voices and the smoky warmth of multiple hearth fires. Wooden benches lined the walls, though many would stand throughout the gathering. At the far end, seated in a carved chair on a slightly raised platform, was the laird himself, deep in conversation with the clan's elderly healer and the master of the hunt. As the last stragglers found places within the hall, a hush fell over the assembled clan members. The laird rose to his feet, his tall frame commanding attention without effort. "People of Clan McConnell," he began, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the room, "I have called you here as the winter approaches to speak of matters that concern us all." The laird's weathered face was grave as he continued. "The harvest has been poor across our lands, and winter promises to be long and bitter. Yet our obligations to the crown remain unchanged." A murmur of discontent rippled through the gathered clan members. Duncan McConnell raised his hand for silence. I know well the hardship this brings to each hearth, but King Alexander's tax collectors will arrive within the fortnight, and we must meet our duty or face dire consequences. Angus felt Moira's hand tighten around his own. Their family's small store of grain, barely enough to see them through until spring, would now be further diminished. The laird's steward, a thin man with calculating eyes, stepped forward with a scroll. Each household will contribute according to their means, he announced, reading names and quantities, in a monotonous voice that belied the weight of his words. McConnell Angus, 3 measures of barley and 1 of oats. The steward barely looked up as he called Angus's name. 3 measures. It was nearly half of what they had stored for winter. Beside him, Moira stiffened, but remained silent, her face a careful mask hiding the fear Angus knew churned within her. We cannot survive the winter on what remains, Callum whispered harshly as they walked home under a canopy of cold stars. The meeting had ended with somber faces and hushed conversations, families calculating their chances of survival against their duty to clan and crown. Angus trudged forward, his mind racing through possibilities. More hunting, perhaps, though game grew scarce in winter, or trading some of their precious wool for grain from coastal villages. By morning's first light, Angus stood before their small grain store, measuring out the required portion with careful hands. Each handful represented days of back-breaking labor in the fields, planting, tending, harvesting, all now destined for royal coffers rather than his children's bellies. Father, must we give so much? Malcolm asked, his young face troubled as he watched the precious grain fall into the collection sack. Aye, lad, Angus replied, resting a calloused hand on his son's shoulder. The laird protects us, gives us land to work, and in return, we owe him our loyalty and a share of what we reap. And he, in turn, owes fealty to the king. The explanation felt hollow even as he spoke it, but such was the way of their world, a chain of obligation that bound them all, from the humblest crofter to the king himself. 3 days later, Angus joined the procession of clan members delivering their tributes to the laird's storehouse. The line of grim-faced farmers, each bearing sacks of grain or other goods, moved slowly forward. Some brought meager offerings, all they could spare without facing starvation. Others, like Fergus the blacksmith, contributed crafted items instead of food. The laird himself stood watching, acknowledging each contribution with a nod, his expression unreadable. Your portion, laird, Angus said, presenting his sack with a respectful bow. Duncan McConnell's eyes met his, and Angus thought he glimpsed a flicker of understanding, perhaps even regret, in the older man's gaze. Your loyalty honors the clan, Angus, the laird replied quietly. May your family find blessing for it. The weeks that followed brought new hardships. With their stores diminished, Angus rose earlier each day to hunt, often returning empty-handed as winter tightened its grip on the Highlands. Moira stretched their meals with wild roots and herbs, the children's portions growing smaller as the snow deepened outside their door. Yet they were not alone in their struggle. Throughout the glen, families faced the same grim arithmetic of survival. Word reached them at midwinter of troubles to the south. A messenger arrived at the clan gathering, his cloak crusted with ice, bearing news that chilled them more than the bitter wind. English raiders have crossed the border, he announced, his voice hoarse from hard riding. They've burned 3 villages near Roxburgh and are moving northward. The southern clans are calling for aid. The hall erupted in voices, some calling for immediate action, others urging caution. The laird silenced them with a raised hand. We cannot ignore this threat, he declared. If the English are not stopped, they will bring fire and sword to our own doorsteps before spring. Within days the village transformed. Men sharpened blades long unused, Women prepared provisions for those who would march, and even children were set to tasks, gathering stones for slings, carrying messages between households. Angus found himself appointed to lead a group of 10 men, his experience as a hunter valued for the coming conflict. "I don't want you to go," Moira said that night as they lay in the darkness, their children sleeping nearby. "We've already given our grain. Must we give our men as well?" Angus pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "If we don't stand with our clan now, there may be nothing left to protect come spring," he whispered. "The English take more than grain. They take lives, Moira." The morning of departure came too quickly. 40 men gathered in the village center, armed with whatever weapons they possessed. Swords for the few who could afford them, axes, hunting bows, and farming implements repurposed for war. Families clustered around their men, final embraces exchanged with few words. Fiona pressed something into Angus's hand, a small carved wooden charm on a leather cord. "For protection," she said solemnly. He tied it around his neck, touched by his daughter's gift. As they prepared to march south, a young boy came running from the path that led to the monastery that stood several miles from their village. "Brother Alpin sends word," he gasped. "Refugees from the south have reached the monastery. The English are closer than we thought." The laird immediately dispatched scouts, including Callum, to assess the threat. "We must know their numbers and how quickly they advance," he ordered. "The rest of us will prepare the village defenses." What had been an offensive march quickly became a desperate scramble to protect their homes. Under the laird's direction, they began constructing barriers at the village approaches, digging ditches where the ground wasn't frozen solid, and preparing positions from which archers could fire upon approaching enemies. By nightfall, Callum returned with grim news. "At least 200 English soldiers, well armed and mounted," he reported. "They've set up camp just 10 miles south. With them are Scottish border raiders, turncoats who know our lands and guide the English through them." A heavy silence fell over the gathered clan members. Their own force was badly outnumbered, their weapons inferior. "We cannot meet them in open battle," the laird acknowledged, "but we know these hills as they never will. We will use that advantage." That night, as plans were made for ambushes in the narrow passes that approached their village, Angus found himself thinking of the monastery that stood on the western approach to their glen. Built of solid stone with high walls, it offered better protection than their wooden palisades and earthen barriers. The women and children could shelter at the monastery, he suggested to the laird. Brother Alpine would surely grant them sanctuary. Duncan McConnell considered this, then nodded slowly. A wise precaution. See to it at first light. Dawn brought a flurry of activity as families gathered essential belongings. Moira packed their few valuables, her mother's silver brooch, the children's winter clothes, a small sack of precious seed grain for spring planting. "I should stay and fight alongside you," she insisted, but Angus shook his head. "The children need you," he said firmly, "and I need to know you're safe if we fail." The procession of women, children, and elders set off for the monastery as the men continued their preparations. Angus watched until Moira and the children disappeared around the bend in the path, then turned back to the grim business of preparing for battle. Brother Alpin, a young monk barely 20 years of age, stood at the monastery gates as the villagers approached. His face, usually serene in prayer, now showed lines of worry. "Welcome," he called, helping an elderly woman across the threshold. "We've prepared the guest hall and chapter house for your accommodation." Inside the monastery walls, Moira and the other women found a strange new world, one of stone corridors and solemn chants, of carefully tended gardens and hushed libraries. Young Malcolm stared wide-eyed at the illuminated manuscripts a monk was working on, while Fiona and Eileen helped distribute blankets to the families settling into the crowded guest hall. Brother Alpin moved among them, offering comfort and organizing space and provisions. "Our stores are limited," he confessed quietly to Moira. "The monastery has struggled since the summer drought, and now with refugees from the south." He left the thought unfinished, but the implication was clear. Even here, hunger threatened. That evening, as the monastery bell called the monks to vespers, Moira stood at the wall, looking northward toward their village, wondering if Angus and the others would survive the coming conflict. Beside her, Brother Alpine paused in his rounds. "Your husband is a strong man," he said gently. "I've seen him bring down a stag at 60 paces. "English soldiers aren't deer," Moira replied, her voice tight with fear. "And arrows fly both ways." The young monk nodded, his own eyes troubled. "I came to the monastery as a boy of 12, he said after a moment. "I thought these walls would separate me from the world's suffering. Instead, I've learned that no stone is thick enough to keep out human cruelty or human courage." He gestured to the families huddled below. "These are difficult times, but I've seen how your people endure." A shout from the watchtower interrupted them. In the distance, an orange glow lit the horizon. Fire in the direction of the village. Moira's hand flew to her mouth, a prayer or a cry of anguish caught in her throat. Around her, other women saw it too, their faces illuminated by the distant flames of what might be their burning homes. "Come," Brother Alpin said firmly, guiding her away from the wall. "There is nothing we can do now but pray and prepare. If your men are forced to retreat, they will come here, and we must be ready to receive them." Through the night, the monastery became a hive of activity. Monks and villagers worked side by side, carrying water to fill every available vessel in case of siege, moving stored food to secure locations, preparing bandages and medicines for the wounded they feared would soon arrive. In the chapel, candles burned as prayers rose continuously, ancient words of supplication offered against the very modern threat that approached with sword and flame. The first whispers of the Black Death reached the Scottish Highlands in the winter of 1349, carried on the same trade winds that brought spices and silks from distant lands. At first, the isolated nature of Highland communities offered some protection, with vast stretches of rugged terrain separating settlements. But death, like the mist that crept through the glens, found its way even to the most remote corners. "Another family in the southern village has fallen ill," Brother Alpin announced one morning, his young face drawn with worry as he addressed the refugees gathered in the monastery's great hall. "The symptoms match what we've heard from travelers. Swellings beneath the arms and neck, fever that burns like fire, and death that comes swiftly, without mercy." Angus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. He had heard tales of this pestilence ravaging the continent, but somehow had believed the sea and mountains would keep it at bay. "What can be done?" he asked, pulling Moira closer to his side, his eyes instinctively seeking out their children among the gathered villagers. Brother Alpine shook his head slowly. "The monastery has ancient texts that speak of plagues from centuries past. The older brothers believe separation is our only defense. Those showing symptoms must be kept apart from the healthy." His voice dropped lower. "We've prepared the old shepherds' huts on the eastern slope. Those who fall ill will be tended there, away from the rest." The plague arrived like a thief in the night. First came Fergus the miller's wife, her neck swollen with dark buboes, her screams of pain echoing through the monastery walls. Then 3 children from the village, followed by one of the elderly monks. Each day brought new victims, and each night more graves were dug in the frozen ground beyond the monastery walls. Angus's family remained untouched, a blessing he attributed to Moira's insistence on boiling their drinking water and washing with vinegar, practices her grandmother had taught her. Others were not so fortunate. By midwinter, nearly a third of their clan lay beneath the cold earth, with more joining them each day. "I never thought I'd outlive so many younger than myself," old Dougal muttered one evening, as he sat by the fire, his gnarled hands working a piece of wood into a simple toy for one of the orphaned children. At 70 winters, the blacksmith was among the oldest in the clan, yet somehow had resisted the plague's touch. "There's wisdom in these old bones that the young would do well to heed." The children gathered around him, drawn by his steady voice and the promise of stories. Even in these darkest days, the children sought comfort in tales and traditions. "Tell us how to stay safe from the sickness," young Malcolm asked, his eyes wide with both fear and curiosity. Dougal nodded solemnly. "My father lived through the great hunger when he was but a lad, and his father before him survived the wars with the Norsemen. Each generation passes down what they've learned." His weathered hands continued their work as he spoke. "Never drink from still water. Sleep with your feet toward the door, so death can't take you by surprise. Burn juniper and rowan in your hearth to ward off evil spirits." Whether these practices held any true protection against the plague, none could say with certainty. But they provided something equally valuable, a sense of control in a world that seemed to have slipped into chaos. The elderly became repositories of knowledge, their years suddenly a precious resource rather than a burden. As winter gave way to spring, the plague's grip began to loosen. New cases became fewer, though the toll had been devastating. Entire families had been erased, fields lay untended, and the silence in once bustling areas of the village spoke volumes of their loss. Yet even in this darkness, the resilient spirit of the Highland people refused to be extinguished. On the first day of May, as tender green shoots pushed through the soil, Angus was surprised to hear the distant sound of pipes echoing across the valley. "What madness is this?" he wondered aloud, stepping outside the monastery walls where many families still sheltered. Moira joined him, her face turned toward the sound. "It's Beltane," she said simply. "The wheel of the year turns, regardless of our sorrows." That evening, against all odds and perhaps against better judgment, the survivors gathered in the open air. A great fire was lit, and around it the remaining members of the clan joined hands. The music began hesitantly at first, a single piper playing a lament for the dead. But gradually the tune shifted, becoming the familiar rhythms of dances performed since time immemorial. "Should we be celebrating when so many are gone?" Angus asked an elder who stood nearby. The old woman looked at him with eyes that had witnessed nearly 8 decades of Highland life. "This isn't mere celebration, lad. This is remembrance. This is defiance. This is how we've survived every calamity since our ancestors first settled these glens, by refusing to let the darkness have the final word." Children who had not smiled in months found themselves swept into simple dances. Stories were shared around the fire, not just tales of those recently lost, but ancient legends of heroes and magical beings that had sustained their people through countless generations of hardship. "My grandmother told me," Moira said as she passed a cup of heather ale to Angus, "that stories are bridges between the living and the dead, between the past and the future. When everything else is taken from us, our stories remain." As the night deepened, the music grew more spirited. Grief remained, a constant companion to all present, but alongside it bloomed something equally powerful, the determination to continue, to plant crops despite depleted hands to tend them, to rebuild homes, to weave new cloth, to forge new tools, to teach the orphaned children the skills they would need to survive in this unforgiving land. The celebration continued until dawn painted the eastern sky with pale light. As the last embers of the Beltane fire faded, Angus looked around at the faces of his clan. Fewer than before, marked by sorrow, yet somehow unbowed. The Highland spirit, like the thistle that served as their symbol, remained prickly and resilient, refusing to be uprooted even by history's most devastating storm.